From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's coming up. On the grain markets, K-State's Dan O'Brien. This week, he'll share his latest projection on wheat, corn, grain, sorghum, and soybean price averages for the current marketing year, as well as the next marketing year coming up, and he'll compare his numbers to those of the USDA. Also today, K-State's Bruno Pedreira will talk about why being careful when taking that first cutting of alfalfa this year is highly important, especially in the drier areas of Kansas. He says that stand productivity for the rest of the growing season is at stake. And later on, we'll bring in K-State's Chip Redmond to fill us in on the latest Kansas agricultural weather outlook. All that straight ahead on this Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network, and you're listening in to Agriculture Today. Glad to have you aboard once more. Grain markets are front and center, of course, as we get this Friday edition rolling. Dan O'Brien along with us from his office in Colby, Northwest Kansas. Grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Dan, just a quick summary of the week here, and then we'll eventually talk about the projections on prices for the marketing year currently and the upcoming marketing year that you've put together. But the markets generally don't seem to have any surge of momentum either direction. Day by day, though, there's a lot of moving around there.
Well, yes, we've heard this week of course, more developments in the Ukraine-Russia war that affect grain markets. Again, it depends on the day. You'll hear a report saying that, yes, Ukraine now has been able to ship grain via rail to other countries, and then by that mode, then they'll be able to move some of their crop into different parts of the world. And that type of news is taken positively. Then you'll hear in short order more plans of military conflict in different parts of the country, damage to ports, all of that. So it seems to be just a lot of raucous uproar with regard to the possibility of Ukraine crop production this year coming off at least partial success. And if that happens, then what are they going to be able to move that to market? So that's out there. More confirmation of the unknowns of South American crop production. If we didn't know it already, we have more verification that dry conditions in parts of Brazil and Argentina earlier on had damaged that soybean crop. Some of that dryness carried over in Mato Grosso, one or two nearby geographic regions, and has raised concerns about dryness affecting that second corn crop. And that's one that mostly goes into export channels. So that's a big issue in the world. In our neck of the woods here in terms of agricultural production areas around the nation, of course, we're still dealing with delayed planting concerns up in the north, lots of excess moisture in terms of snow, delaying planting, et cetera. You look at the drought monitor maps for the western fourth of the Corn Belt, and not much relief there. Lots of concern. In Kansas, it's pretty difficult to see other parts of the world when you see great concern about moisture needs for the wheat crop. We're starting to talk about prevented planting rules and regulations out here in the western third of the state for some of those driest of areas. So just real challenges in the market. And with all that, on yesterday's closes, you see Dees corn closing at $7.51 3/4. May contract, which is just about to enter into delivery, of course, at $8.16. The July contract for corn, July 22, $8.13, and then we're generally declining off into harvest from there. Soybeans, in terms of all this concern happening in the world, you see May trading over $17. November 2022 at $15.21, and we're not even really shocked by those numbers. And when we look at wheat, the May contract, again, just like corn, not far from entering into delivery, $11.36. July, the new crop contract, $11.41. And what I guess impresses me is that, I know how we got to our current situation with the U.S. wheat price for this marketing year, with the front end being what in hindsight now is pretty low prices relative to where we're at now. So I know where we're at now in terms of wheat with a $7.60 season average price. But when you look at these futures on down the road, they all have 10s and 11s in front of them, and to have any type of representative basis at all. So we're looking at $10 plus wheat on into that next market year, and that starts June 1. In the oilseed complex, major issue has occurred in the last several days, where Indonesia, with a short palm oil crop, has decided to cut off, at least temporarily, palm oil exports. So that tightens up cooking oil supplies around the globe. You bring all this together, and there's a lot riding on the United States, North America, having at least an okay crop to bring stability to food markets, to concerns about shortages of different food supplies coming on into this year. We've even reignited the food versus fuel debate again in the last week. So that's how tight times are with regard to these supplies and how much concern we have.
And it makes sense that the markets will be quite reactionary to any planting time developments with any of our row crops, as you're saying. Dan, you mentioned it, that you have numbers here on seasonal prices that you've put together compared to the USDA's for the current marketing year, as well as the new marketing year upcoming. You brought up your wheat figure just a second ago. What are you thinking along the lines of corn and soybeans as far as those numbers?
Well, note that in doing that the USDA and its May 12th WASDE report, World Agricultural Supply Demand Estimates report, will come up with the new set of numbers for this marketing year that we're going to be entering into once we get the harvest done. And that's the one that'll start September 1st for corn and soybeans and grain sorghum, start June 1st for wheat. But the USDA had projected for corn for this marketing year, the one we're in, that will finish at about a $5.80 average price. It's $5.80. And again, we have futures running over $8. So you had a very front-loaded marketing year when in hindsight, $5 corn looks pretty low right now. But coming out of last harvest, we had a lot lower prices than we have now. So a lot of weighting of that. But when you look out into that next marketing year for corn, it looks like we're closer to something akin to about $7.05 or something over $7. Even that with what the futures are saying and basis estimates, the USDA may be saying $5.80 for this marketing year, but by my own calculations, the futures now are probably saying something indicating that we have season average prices for this year probably about 45 to 50 cents higher than that. That's $6.25. So the USDA is caught short on their price projections on a rising market. So how do they address that? Yeah. So you have that situation. Soybeans in particular are an eye-opener to me anyway, in that USDA has projected this year's season average price of about $13.25, and that's about what the futures are saying too. But where do we go next year? Again, for the next marketing year, starting on September 1, it looks like we'd be about $80 to $1 per bushel higher than that, something at $14 or more. That's almost a head spinner of a situation. But when you look at the futures out into November's at $15.21, November of this year, that for the new crop bid, and January, again, all those months are over $15. So basically we're taking about $1 basis off of those months out there, which is not far off of where we're at, and figuring that $14.25, something like that's probably where we're going to be. And it brings attention to the tightness of our situation. And really, you start to wonder, and I'm sure futures traders start to wonder, well, what's driving them to these high prices? Are they justified as they look out in the future? And economists have long-ranging debates about how much risk gets represented in the futures. But for me right now, how can we deny that these futures, 12, 18 months out, are not representing a whole bunch of risk and uncertainty as we look at it in the future for grain markets?
And should mention, since you have it in your notes, your grain sorghum numbers similarly here.
Yes.
They follow the pace of corn, one would think?
Yes. In fact, for grain sorghum, whereas you project corn at about 7.05, for grain sorghum numbers, you're looking at, for that next marketing year, something about 50 cents even higher than that. And that's given, in general, the good national basis we've seen in grain sorghum. So if we're projecting 705 by calculations I've got for that next market year for corn, then 762 thereabouts for grain sorghum. And the current grain sorghum prices projected about 585 in the current market years. As we finish that out, you're looking at about 665. So if anything, the grain sorghum prices, what the futures representing, are even higher relative to the USDA's projections than for corn. So I just want to come back to what will happen on May the 12th. The USDA has a bullseye on them. And not to use just a bunch of hyperbole, but the futures are projecting pretty high prices. So the USDA could take the idea of saying that, well, by the time we get there, we'll have a good crop, et cetera. We'll have good crops. We'll tend to see things come lower, a lot lower than where they're at now. But if they do that, they're representing different scenarios than the futures are bidding right now. The futures are bidding in the risk and uncertainty in these markets, and not just weather and crop risk. We have a geopolitical conflict to deal with. I would think that what USDA will probably do is be conservative, and they'll come in with a high price, but somewhat lower than what the futures are bidding right now. And then we'll see how those things converge as we move on in months beyond that.
Yeah. Well, you've written up a great deal on all of that in your notes, and might just mention that you have the latest on exports, where we're moving corn and soybeans quite well. Find those notes at agmanager.info. As always, they're posted weekly by Dan, and we will talk again next Friday. Thanks, Dan, once again.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
He is grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension. We'll be back with more on Agriculture Today. We're back now on this Agriculture Today. Right here, we want to talk about alfalfa, one of our more enduring forage crops grown in Kansas. It's known as the queen of forages in many quarters. But extended dry weather, like we've had here in the state, does leave its mark on this crop as well. Some important early season management considerations, plus more. Joining us via phone is Bruno Pedreira, Southeast Kansas Research and Extension agronomist. He actually has been talking legumes and other things at the Eastern Kansas Grazing School this week. Bruno, as we look at the first cutting of alfalfa this spring, you think that producers need to be a little more cautious about that cutting?
Yes, Eric, yes, and thank you again for having me here with you guys. The first cut is very important to us because now during the springtime, alfalfa starts to regrow, and the regrowth is a little bit delayed because of the shorter photo period yet. We are still getting warm, and, well, in some parts of the state, we didn't get the moisture we need yet. So we have some growth, but not in the pace we want to have. And at the same point, we need to remember that the alfalfa was dormant during the winter. So right now, we are kind of using the carbohydrate reserves we had stored in the top root of the alfalfa to get this new regrowth. So what we are seeing in the field right now is the new plants that are coming from the carbohydrates we stored last year. And the plants are using it to get the new leaves, the new plants. But at the same time, we are having some regrowth coming from the crown. And that will be our second harvest. That will be the second generation of plants. So we need to take care at this point and take a look at the alfalfa fields to see where you are, because we need to cut it in this first cut and this first harvest. Waiting too much, we cannot wait till the 1/10 bloom, which is the recommendation, and we need to take a look more in the crown regrowth, because if you are getting a lot of crown regrowth, we need to go ahead and harvest it even before getting into the 1/10 bloom, which is the recommendation.
So instead of waiting on harvest, one might actually go ahead and harvest on the calendar anyway, slightly earlier than they normally would?
Yeah, slightly earlier than the 1/10 bloom if we are getting this crown regrowth. Mm-hmm. So if your crown regrowth is getting close to the 2 inches cutting height that we used to have for alfalfa, 2-3 inches, we need to cut it before have a chance to cut in it. We need to make sure that this second generation of plants that are coming from the regrowth we will be using as a second cut and not be cutting in the first cutting.
In other words, you don't want to scalp that stand in the first cutting. What will happen? Explain, if you would, further, if in fact one digs into that crown growth at this point. Will it simply delay the second cutting, or will it hamper productivity? What occurs there?
Yeah, that's a good point. If we delay a little bit now when we harvest in the first cut, we also harvest the second generation of plants, we're going to delay the next cut because we are using the reserves to get both reserves, and we are not leaving leaves behind. So the plants will, they will need to rely on the rest of the reserves we have in the tap roots. And with that, we can reduce a little bit the stand. We can kind of compromise the second harvest. So that's very important to take a look and see if you have regrowth coming from the crown. If so, you need to cut it before the recommendation, which is the 1/10 zone.
It does start with scouting your stands, doesn't it? One must get out there and take a look, and a fairly extensive look throughout the field, get some good notion of how the stand is doing across the way?
Yes. We need to go there, take a look, see what we have right now, and make sure that we will kind of optimize, forage yield and forage quality, and yes, stand longevity. I think that's the most important thing to get longevity. It's not cheaper to plant alfalfa, so when we get a good stand, we're going to have it for longer, and taking care of the first cutting will help us a lot to get a really good second harvest and go forward.
I want to ask you something else before we move on to another topic here. Should producers, given the dryness, more or less expect that they may not get that fourth cutting or that last cutting that they normally get?
Yeah, maybe this year will be one of the years. Well, if that's not me telling you that, but all the forecasts we have show us that we're going to have a dry year. So I think you were right, Eric. We should expect one last cut this year, and we should make sure, again, that we're going to have the last cut at least 4-6 weeks before we get the average killing freezing date in your region to allow the plants to replenish the reserves and go through the winter. So that's another thing we can discuss here late this year, but that's very important to take a look when we are getting late and early in the fall to decide the right moment to get the last cut done, and then allow some time to the plants to regrow, replenish the reserves, and then they can go through the winter without any kind of damage.
May need to retune one's alfalfa management this year because of the conditions that be. Something else we wanted to briefly share today. Bruno, you discussed at that Eastern Kansas Grazing School a number of topics, including this one, interseeding legume crops, and alfalfa could be an option there, into fescue pastures. For what purpose? Talk about this.
Well, that's interesting. We have been discussing it, Eric, because, fescue is largely used in the U.S. overall. We have millions of acres of fescues, and also in Kansas as well, especially in the eastern part here. And we know that fescues kind of goes dormant July, August, when we have the peak of the summer, hot days, sometimes low in moisture. But we can interseed some legumes like alfalfa, as we were talking here, and red clover or ladino or white clovers that will help us to improve yield and quality out of our fescue fields. So we were talking here in Princeton at Eastern Kansas Grazing School about it and how important it could be. And we have some data out of Kansas showing us that we can increase in 3, 4, 5% points in terms of crude protein in our pasture. It helps the passage rate, the digestibility. Microbes in the rumen will work better. And by the end of the day, we could have animals that will present a better daily gain weight. So that's a kind of practice that we are trying to study more in Kansas and try to encourage farmers to discuss about it. It requires that you know a little bit more about soil fertility because legumes are kind of need more in terms of fertility. So pH needs to be corrected. We need to understand a little bit more how it is in terms of soil chemicals. And then we can have a really nice mix that will help producers to make more beef out of our acres in Kansas.
Interesting prospect here. At what point of the growing season would one actually conduct the interseeding then?
Well, depends on the legumes we are talking. Most of these legumes we need to start to work in the pasture in the fall during the winter, kind of overgrazing it to reduce the amount of pastures we have, the forage we have in the pasture. And then during the springtime, we're going to kind of drill it or broadcast, keep the animals grazing it for a while up to see some of the legumes, germinating up to an inch and a half. Then we take the animals out, let the legumes grow into the pasture, and after that we start to manage those pastures based on the legumes, not more based on the fescue hides or fescue stubble hides. Everything should be done after that, thinking more in the legume rather than in the forage you were working with. Yeah. So this is the kind of quick start if you want to thinking about interseed legumes in your pastures.
It might be a little late to start this project at this point of the season then?
Yes, I would say that would be a kind of plan for next year, so you can put in your schedule and start to work in the pastures in the next fall.
Yeah. If one would like to learn more about starting this system and reinforcing their fescue pastures with a legume interseeding, you would be happy to share what you've learned through your research on this, would you not?
Oh, yes, sure. We can do it as much as you guys need.
You can contact Bruno at the Southeast Research and Extension Center, and he'll be more than happy to have a conversation with you about that aspect of managing that cool season grass, in this case fescue, bolstering it with a legume planting interseeded. Bruno, thanks for all the comments right here, and we will catch up with you again quite soon. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Eric.
He's Bruno Pedreira, K-State Research and Extension agronomist based in southeast Kansas. Once more, he was one of the featured speakers again at that Eastern Kansas grazing school hosted by K-State Research and Extension in Princeton earlier this week. Briefly back to alfalfa for a moment. As we've been reporting to you here through input from K-State's Jeff Whitworth, weevils and pea aphids have been working alfalfa stands over pretty good in parts of Kansas, and Jeff has just posted the very latest update on that activity with recommendations on how to respond to it growers in this week's Agronomy e-Update newsletter out of K-State. You might want to give that a read. It's at eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. And we'll be back with more for you after this break. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Closing out this Agriculture Today, it's our glance at Kansas agricultural weather, and we will, for a change, talk about more promising expectations of rainfall coming up soon. Chip Redmond is along with us once again, meteorologist with K-State Research and Extension. We'll get into those forecasts in just a second, Chip. But you have been discussing with folks, and the comments have been, well, they've been flying here in the Central Plains and elsewhere about wind. Again, this past week was another example of just how relentless that wind has been.
Yeah, honestly, in the last week, the wind hasn't been that bad, but we've had several episodes of pretty significant wind across the state here in April. The strongest winds have been in western Kansas, obviously, where they have less obstacles and it's a little bit flatter. We're measuring above normal wind for especially Dodge City and Goodland so far this month, by up to 3 to 4, even 5 mile an hour average over the entire month. That's a lot. When we look at central Kansas, not quite as much, near average. And actually, eastern Kansas is at average to slightly below average with winds. And that's interesting just because, well, they've had a little bit more green up, I think, in the east, where the green surface doesn't absorb as much solar radiation, is a little bit more reflective, and as a result, the surface isn't holding as much of the sun's heat. When it does that, it warms the air above it, that air rises, and when it rises, it mixes into stronger winds. And so western Kansas and even portions of central Kansas have been able to obtain stronger winds as we mix more of that lower atmosphere, whereas eastern Kansas, on the other hand, hasn't been nearly as brown at the surface over the last month because they did see some green up, and southeast is fully greened up, and so they're not quite mixing as much. It also goes into play with the clouds. We've had a really, really sunny April. It's a transition month, and we typically see more clouds associated with these storm systems that are supposed to bring rain, but we're at record dryness. Many parts of the state, including Manhattan, we're at the driest April on record. And so that's really helpful to have abundant sun, which helps mix the lower atmosphere and helps stronger winds.
It really is intriguing how soil cover, cloud cover, all of it interacts to affect our winds in Kansas. So we have had some rainfall overnight, Chip, and as we look ahead to the rest of today and then past the weekend, there appear to be repeated opportunities for rain. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, the Southwest was a big winner, especially if you were in and around Meade County, where they had 2.5 inches of rain Wednesday night. And that surrounding area also saw as much as about a half inch to an inch. Statewide averages vary. For this time of year, the weekly average is about 1.5 inches in the southeast to as little as 0.3 of an inch in the southwest. Looking out, today we expect severe thunderstorms in the eastern part of the state. They're going to be very widely scattered. We'll kind of get a break on Saturday and even into Sunday to Sunday evening. Then we're going to see the next storm system come in on Monday, and that looks to bring a little bit more widespread precipitation. It's still a few days off. It could still trend in the wrong direction. But with that system Monday and then potentially another system later that week, we're in kind of an active pattern here. We just introduced chances of rain. The more chances of rain, the better odds we have of getting our average precipitation. So right now, highest amounts are predicted, as always, along the Missouri border. They could see potentially up to 2 to potentially 3 inches of rain over the next week.
And if you look further from there to the west, what are some of those quantitative forecasts saying?
Yeah, they drop off with western extent. The kind of the 81 corridor is where we start to see the maximum of about 1 inch, and then further west from there, we're looking at only at 1/4 to potentially 1/2 inch. And once again, we're looking a week out for these highest moisture amounts, and even as short a period as 3 days out, and that can change significantly.
Well, we will be more than happy to see what comes along in the days ahead, and we appreciate the time as always, Chip. Good weekend to you. Thanks.
Yep, you as well.
He is Chip Redmond, meteorologist with K-State Research and Extension. And our time's away once more. A good weekend to you, and thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.